History Secrets.
There is a point on the world map that many strategists consider one of the most sensitive places on the planet. A narrow strait of water just over 30 kilometers wide, the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it may seem like just another maritime passage, but its importance goes far beyond that. Approximately 20% of all oil traded in the world passes through it. Ships depart daily from Gulf countries, carrying energy that powers entire economies. A large portion of this oil is headed to Asia, India, China, South Korea, Japan. These economies depend deeply on this energy flow. Some countries import most of their oil precisely from this region. This means that any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would have immediate effects on the global economy. Energy, transport, industrial production, everything could be affected. But the impact would not be only energetic. There's also an important financial dimension. For decades, the global oil trade has been linked to the use of the US dollar. This system became known as the petrodollar. In this arrangement, a large portion of international oil transactions takes place using the American currency. This helps sustain global demand for dollars, and consequently strengthens the economic position of the United States in the international financial system. For this reason, the stability of the Persian Gulf has always been considered strategic for Washington. Several American military bases have been established in the region over the past decades. These bases are part of a network of military presence that stretches across the entire Middle East. However, the geography of the region creates complex challenges. On one side of the strait lies Iran, a country with mountainous territory and significant strategic depth. On the other side are the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, regions largely desert and with highly concentrated infrastructure. This geographical difference has important military implications. Mountainous territories can offer natural locations to hide military equipment, missile bases, underground facilities, defense systems. Desert and urbanized areas, on the other hand, tend to be more exposed. Energy infrastructure, ports, industrial plants. These targets can be vulnerable in conflict scenarios. Another critical factor is dependence on basic resources. Many Gulf countries import a large portion of their food. In addition, they face shortages of potable water. To meet this need, they extensively use desalination plants. These facilities turn seawater into fresh water. They are essential for supplying millions of people. Without these plants, entire cities would struggle to survive in such arid regions. This creates a strategic vulnerability. Concentrated critical infrastructure can become targets in scenarios of military tension. Energy, water, ports. At the same time, Iran itself also faces structural challenges. Climate change, prolonged periods of drought, pressure on water supply. These vulnerabilities show how modern conflicts may involve not only traditional military forces, but also civilian infrastructure, natural resources, economic systems. Another important element in the regional dynamic is the presence of multiple international actors. United States, European countries, Russia, China, all have strategic interests in the Middle East. Because of the region's energy importance, any local conflict can quickly take on global dimensions. Maritime routes, financial markets, energy prices. This type of interdependence makes the regional balance extremely delicate. Small escalations can produce wide-ranging effects. At the same time, Technological development is changing the nature of conflicts. Drones, long-range missiles, decentralized command systems. These tools allow smaller actors to challenge traditional military forces. This creates a more complex strategic environment. Traditional military powers still possess enormous capacity, but they face new types of asymmetric threats. Within this scenario, some analysts describe the Middle East as an extremely sensitive geopolitical chessboard, a region where local rivalries mix with global disputes. And at the center of this chessboard lies that very narrow strait of just a few dozen kilometers, an apparently small passage, but capable of influencing the energy and economic stability of the entire planet. If we look more deeply at the strategic balance of the Persian Gulf, we realize that potential conflict in this region does not depend only on military power. It depends, above all, on geography. Geography determines trade routes, defines logistical vulnerabilities, and often reveals which regions have natural advantages in a war scenario. In the case of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's position offers a particular type of strategic advantage. Its mountainous territory allows defense systems and attack platforms to be concealed in areas that are difficult to reach. These mountains create a naturally defensive environment. Military installations can be hidden in tunnels. Mobile launchers can be moved quickly. Drone systems can operate from positions that are difficult to detect. This type of geography turns the territory into something close to a natural fortress. On the other side of the Gulf, the situation is very different. Most Gulf Cooperation Council countries have flat, desert territory. Critical infrastructure is concentrated in specific regions: ports, refineries, oil fields, desalination plants. These elements are essential for the functioning of local economies, but they can also become vulnerable in scenarios of military tension, especially in an era marked by drones, precision missiles, and long-range attacks. In addition to energy, there is another fundamental resource in this region: water. In many Gulf countries, most potable water comes from desalination plants. These facilities use energy to turn seawater into fresh water. Without these plants, large cities simply would not be able to sustain their populations. This makes these structures an essential part of regional strategic infrastructure. On the other hand, Iran itself faces significant environmental challenges: prolonged droughts, reduction of reservoirs, pressure on water supply in several regions of the country. This type of fragility shows how contemporary conflicts do not involve only armed forces. They may involve basic resources: water, energy, civil infrastructure. Another important aspect of the regional dynamic is the role of foreign military bases. The United States maintains several military installations throughout the Middle East. These bases were established over decades, especially during the Cold War and subsequent conflicts in the region. They function as points of strategic presence. They allow power projection, logistical coordination, regional monitoring. But the presence of these bases also creates a complex environment. In scenarios of tension, they can become potential targets. This turns local conflicts into disputes with international implications. Another element that makes the situation delicate is the possibility of escalation involving other powers. European countries have important energy interests in the region. Russia and China also closely monitor any change in the strategic balance of the Middle East. Because of this network of overlapping interests, a regional conflict could quickly gain broader dimensions: trade routes, energy markets, military alliances. This type of scenario leads many analysts to describe the Persian Gulf as one of the most sensitive regions in the international system. Small crises can generate large consequences. At the same time, history shows that geopolitical rivalries often go through periods of tension, followed by moments of diplomatic adjustment. Negotiations, agreements, temporary balances. The future of the region will depend largely on the ability of the involved powers to manage these tensions, avoid unnecessary escalations, and preserve the stability of global energy routes. Because in the end, that seemingly small strait continues to be one of the most strategic points on the planet, a narrow maritime corridor, but with potential impact on the entire global economy. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
There is a moment in history when an empire ceases to be invincible, yet still does not realize it. It was exactly this hypothesis that began to gain traction when Professor Jung, known for applying game theory to geopolitics, presented a prediction that at first glance seemed too bold. He not only anticipated a domestic political victory in the United States, but also stated that the country would go to war with Iran and lose. Today, with the first signs of this conflict emerging, the question is no longer whether this prediction was radical. The question is whether it might be correct. The analysis starts from a simple but deeply uncomfortable point. This is not a conventional war. It is a war of attrition, where time, cost, and resilience matter more than raw power. According to this view, Iran did not enter this scenario unprepared. On the contrary, for more than 2 decades, the country has been structuring its strategy with a specific focus on this type of confrontation, not only in the military field, but also in the psychological, economic, and ideological domains. Within Iran's own internal narrative, this conflict is interpreted as something greater than geopolitics. It is seen as a war against a symbolic enemy, an adversary that represents a global order to be challenged. This dimension completely changes the level of commitment involved. And perhaps this is exactly where the first asymmetry emerges. While the United States operates within political cycles and internal pressures, Iran operates within a long-term strategic horizon, where immediate losses can be acceptable if they contribute to the structural exhaustion of the opponent. This difference in mindset begins to reflect on the battlefield. In recent conflicts, forces aligned with Iran had the opportunity to directly observe American and Israeli military capabilities, not only in theory, but in real practice. This allowed rapid adjustments, tactical learning, and refinement of strategies. And the result begins to appear in a silent, yet consistent way. The war ceases to be direct and starts to target sensitive points of the global system: energy infrastructure, trade routes, supply of essential resources. The focus is not only on winning battles, but on creating instability. A critical example of this approach lies in the structural dependence of Gulf countries. Entire regions depend on highly vulnerable systems, such as desalination plants, responsible for a large portion of water supply. The destruction of a single facility can trigger a chain collapse. And here emerges a data point that completely changes the perception of scale. In many cases, the cost of an attack is negligible compared to the impact generated. Relatively cheap drones can compromise structures that sustain millions of people. This logic redefines the concept of military superiority. It is no longer about who has more technology, but who can impose greater exhaustion at lower cost. At the same time, another element comes into play: control of strategic routes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a large portion of global energy flow passes, becomes a decisive pressure point. Any disruption there affects not only countries in the region, but the entire global economy. And this creates a cascading effect. The Gulf countries, highly dependent on these routes, begin to face existential risks, not only economic, but structural. And here, an even deeper connection emerges. These same nations are responsible for financially fueling critical sectors of the American economy, especially when it comes to investments in technology and artificial intelligence. If this flow is interrupted, the impact will not be localized. It spreads. The so-called tech bubble becomes directly dependent on the stability of regions that are now under constant threat. This raises an uncomfortable hypothesis. Perhaps this war is not being fought only on the military field, but in the heart of the global financial system. And if that is true, the conflict ceases to be regional. It becomes structural. The question, then, is no longer who will win on the battlefield, but which system will be able to survive the exhaustion. There is a persistent illusion in modern conflicts that technological superiority guarantees victory. But in certain scenarios, this same technology becomes a weakness. What begins to emerge in this conflict is an asymmetry that is difficult to ignore. On one side, extremely sophisticated systems, designed over decades, with high costs and complex operations. On the other, simple, cheap, and highly replicable solutions. And this difference is not only technical, it is structural. When a single ballistic missile requires multiple interceptors to be neutralized, and each interceptor costs dozens of times more than the target, the economic balance of war begins to break. It is no longer about defensive capability. It is about sustainability. If the cost of defense is higher than the cost of attack, time starts working against the side with more resources. This inversion completely alters strategic logic. For decades, the American military apparatus was built on a specific paradigm. A model inherited from the post-World War II era, shaped by the Cold War, where demonstrating technological superiority was an essential part of deterrence. But this model was designed for another type of war. A war of power display, technological race, strategic symbolism. Not necessarily a prolonged war of continuous attrition. And it is exactly this type of conflict that we are entering in. The consequences of this begin to appear in a way that is almost imperceptible, yet profoundly significant. The so-called aura of invincibility, built over decades, begins to fragment, not through a direct defeat, but through a sequence of small signals that, when combined, indicate vulnerability. And when this perception changes, the impact goes far beyond the military field. Global confidence in a power does not depend only on its real strength, but on the perception of that strength. When that perception shifts, alliances begin to be reassessed. Markets react, and strategic decisions start to be made based on a new scenario. It is at this point that a possible historical transition emerges. The idea of a single hegemony begins to give way to a more fragmented, more distributed, more unpredictable world, a multipolar world. And this transition does not happen in an organized way. It happens under tension. At the same time, another variable comes into play: resource exhaustion. In modern wars, it is not only soldiers who become exhausted. Entire systems do. Munitions, interceptors, supply chains. Every launch, every defense, every response carries a cost that must be sustained over time. And when that cost accumulates, it begins to impose limits. If replenishment does not keep up with the pace of consumption, operational capacity deteriorates. And this creates a dangerous scenario. Because as options decrease, more radical decisions begin to emerge. Among them, one of the most delicate: the use of ground troops. Historically, regime changes have never been achieved exclusively through air power. There is a limit to what can be done from a distance. And this limit inevitably leads to the need for physical presence. But this move carries enormous risk. Not only military, but political. Public opinion, especially in democracies, tends to resist prolonged conflicts with high human cost. And in this specific case, there are clear signs that a large portion of the population does not support an escalation of this kind. This creates a dilemma. On one hand, there is external pressure from strategic allies who directly depend on intervention. On the other, there is internal resistance. And in the middle of this, decisions must be made. If ground troops are deployed, the conflict enters a new phase. A phase where the cost is no longer only financial, but human. And historically, this type of transition rarely occurs without deep consequences. At the same time, there is an alternative, albeit controversial: indirect negotiation. The attempt to contain the situation through concessions. But this option also carries a cost. It may be interpreted as weakness. And in a scenario where perception is already being questioned, this may further accelerate the loss of global influence. What makes this situation particularly complex is that there is no simple way out. Each path carries significant risks. Each decision may trigger effects that go far beyond the battlefield. And perhaps this is the true nature of this moment. Not just a conflict between nations, but a turning point in the very structure of global power. There is a question that is rarely asked directly, but that in moments like this becomes inevitable. Why move forward in a conflict that presents so many evident risks? When strategic decisions seem to contradict technical analyses, military projections, and even internal recommendations, the need arises to look beyond the surface. And it is at this point that different interpretations begin to emerge. One of them is ancient, recurring, and at the same time, extremely human. The arrogance of empires. Throughout history, dominant powers have often made the same mistake. After a sequence of victories or displays of strength, a perception of invulnerability emerges. A confidence that ceases to be based on data and becomes sustained by feeling. This pattern repeats itself in an almost predictable way. Rapid victories create an illusion of absolute superiority. And under this illusion, decisions begin to be made based on unrealistic expectations about one's own capacity. The problem is that reality rarely adjusts to this perception. And when confrontation happens in an environment different from the one for which the power was prepared, this confidence can turn into vulnerability. History offers multiple examples of this pattern. Powers that, at their peak, made decisions that accelerated their own decline, not because they lacked resources, but because they misread reality. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so delicate. The risk is not only in the conflict itself, but in the interpretation of it. If the scenario is underestimated, decisions may be made that deepen the problem. If it is overestimated, unnecessary reactions may be triggered. In both cases, the margin for error becomes minimal. At the same time, there is an element that rarely appears in official analyses: the human factor. Leaders are not purely rational entities. They are influenced by internal pressures, expectations, narratives, personal history. And these elements can shape decisions as much as data itself. This adds a layer of unpredictability that no model can fully anticipate. Because, in the end, geopolitical decisions are also human decisions. And humans, even at the highest levels of power, are subject to biases, to fears, to ambitions, to the need to maintain control. And when all of this is combined in a high-tension environment, the outcome becomes uncertain. Perhaps the most important point of all this is to understand that we are not only witnessing a possible conflict, we are witnessing a structural transition, the end of one logic, and the beginning of another. A world where power is no longer concentrated in a single center, but distributed across multiple actors, each with their own interests, strategies, and limits. And this type of world tends to be more unstable, more dynamic, more difficult to predict. Which brings us to a final reflection. When global order begins to fragment, what replaces it? Is there a new model ready to take its place? Or are we entering a prolonged period of adjustment, where rules will be tested, challenged, and redefined? There is no clear answer, and perhaps that is exactly what defines this moment. Not certainty, but the absence of it. A silent transition, gradual, but deeply transformative. And like all transitions of this magnitude, its true impact will only be fully understood when it is already complete. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
Today we are going to enter one of the most controversial topics in contemporary geopolitical debate. A topic that requires care, critical analysis, and awareness that many interpretations are merely analytical hypotheses. When intense conflicts occur on the international stage, different narratives emerge to explain what is happening. Some focus on political factors, others on historical factors, and others seek cultural or religious interpretations. The conflict involving Israel and Gaza has provoked exactly this kind of narrative dispute. Images of destruction, civilian suffering, and strong emotional reactions around the world. For some analysts, understanding these events requires looking at broader patterns in human history, especially the way societies use violence in times of conflict. Throughout history, different civilizations have developed symbolic rituals linked to war. Some of these rituals involved public demonstrations of power. The Aztecs, for example, carried out religious ceremonies associated with human sacrifice before or after military campaigns. These practices had both religious and political meanings. In other ancient cultures, such as some Mediterranean societies, historical accounts mention similar rituals, although many of these records are debated among historians. The Romans also celebrated military victories through public ceremonies known as triumphs. Victorious generals paraded through the city accompanied by prisoners of war. These events served to reinforce the power of the state, and also to unify the population around military achievements. Some analysts use these historical examples to discuss how violence can acquire symbolic meanings in political contexts, not only as a military instrument, but also as a strategic message. Within this interpretative logic, certain violent events can be seen as demonstrations intended to influence public perception, both inside and outside a country. In the case of the current conflict in the Middle East, different interpretations attempt to explain the motivations behind military actions. Some focus on security objectives. Others point to internal political dynamics. There is also a line of analysis that observes how intense conflicts can strengthen national cohesion, especially when a society perceives that it faces external threats. This phenomenon is not exclusive to any specific region. It appears repeatedly in the history of different countries. Wars often produce moments of strong social mobilization. Populations unite in the face of perceived dangers. Ancient military strategies sometimes explored exactly this principle, creating situations in which soldiers had no possibility of retreat. In Chinese military history, for example, there is a tactic known as fighting with the river at your back. An army is placed facing the enemy with a natural obstacle behind it. With no possibility of escape, soldiers are forced to fight with maximum determination. The logic is simple. When there is no alternative, group cohesion increases. Some analysts use this metaphor to describe situations in which governments or societies perceive that they are cornered, when they believe there is no easy way out of a conflict. In these contexts, political decisions can become more radical, and national rhetoric can intensify. It is important to remember that interpretations of this kind are only analytical models. They attempt to explain collective behaviors observed in extreme situations. But real conflicts are always more complex. They involve multiple factors: historical, political, religious, and strategic. In addition, narratives about conflicts often reflect different ideological positions. Each side of the debate emphasizes different aspects of reality. For this reason, understanding international conflicts requires a critical approach, comparing sources, analyzing historical contexts, and recognizing the complexity of events. The objective of analyzing theories and interpretations is not to automatically accept any narrative, but to expand the ability to understand how different worldviews attempt to explain dramatic events. Especially in a world where information circulates rapidly, and where competing narratives dispute global attention. In the end, studying these interpretations reveals something important about the very nature of international politics. Conflicts are rarely only military. They are also narrative. Each side tries to explain its actions, justify its decisions, and influence how the world interprets events. Understanding these narratives does not resolve conflicts, but it helps to better understand the forces that shape the contemporary international landscape. As this analysis continues, a central question then arises: why do certain conflicts seem to intensify even when the international consequences are extremely negative? In many cases, military actions generate global condemnation. Protests emerge in different countries. International public opinion reacts with indignation. But, paradoxically, these external reactions can sometimes strengthen the internal cohesion of a society in conflict. When a country feels that it is being criticized or attacked by external forces, a known psychological dynamic can emerge: the so-called Siege effect. In this effect, external criticism is perceived not only as political opposition, but as existential threats. This can lead to a strengthening of collective identity. Populations unite around national symbols. Governments begin to emphasize narratives of survival, of defense, of resistance against external forces. This phenomenon appears in various historical contexts. During wars, external criticism often reinforces internal solidarity. Even deeply divided societies can temporarily unite in the face of a common enemy. Some analysts argue that, in certain cases, political leaders may even exploit this mechanism. Intense conflicts generate emotional mobilization. Emotional mobilization can strengthen internal political support, especially in moments of crisis. This does not mean that conflicts are created solely for political reasons, but it means that conflicts can produce significant political effects. Another element frequently discussed involves religious or ideological narratives. In some lines of thought, historical events are interpreted within eschatological views. Eschatology is the study of scenarios about the end of times, or final transformations of the world order. In different religious traditions, these narratives describe great confrontations between opposing forces. Some analysts suggest that religious interpretations may influence political views in certain contexts, especially when leaders or movements use these narratives to mobilize support. However, it is important to emphasize that these interpretations represent only one among many possible explanations. Modern conflicts generally result from a complex combination of factors: territorial disputes, colonial history, national security. In addition to economic and internal political factors, Reducing any conflict to a single cause rarely captures the full reality. Even so, studying different interpretations helps to understand how narratives are used in political disputes. Because wars do not happen only on the military field, they also happen in the symbolic field. Governments, movements, and leaders compete for control of narratives. They try to influence how the public interprets events. And in an era of social media and instant global communication, these narratives spread rapidly. Images, speeches, official statements. Everything becomes part of a battle for legitimacy, a battle for influence over global public opinion. In this scenario, understanding different interpretations becomes essential, even those that seem controversial. Not because all of them are true, but because they reveal how different groups perceive the world. And these perceptions, whether true or not, influence real political decisions. They influence alliances. They influence strategies. For this reason, analyzing geopolitical theories always requires a critical stance, separating verifiable facts from speculative interpretations, and recognizing that international reality is rarely simple. Perhaps this is one of the most important lessons when studying contemporary conflicts: the constant need to question narratives, compare sources, and understand the complexity of the relationships between power, politics, and society. Only then can we begin to understand why seemingly incomprehensible events continue to occur on the international stage, and why debates about these events remain so intense around the world. Throughout history, many events have been recorded, but others have disappeared over time. Lost manuscripts, forgotten accounts, evidence that never reached us. But this raises an inevitable question. How many truths of history do we really know? Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.